I've decided to start this series on gun control in America with a very important topic which I hope will permeate our discussion moving forward: futility. I want this video to serve as a foundation on which to weigh the others you may watch later, or if this is the last one you watch, then all the discussions about guns in America you have from this point on. That is to say, understand that no matter what facts I present from this point on, arguing for the benefits of gun ownership, the rewards of an armed populace, etc., whatever else I get into, understand that all of that rests on the one assumption, the topic of this video, that any form of sweeping gun control in this country will be completely ineffective at preventing access to guns from those who should not have them. This is an idea that many people will have trouble with. What do I mean that it's futile? Let me break it down. It is my opinion, with the large knowledge of firearms that I have, that it is far easier for a motivated individual to acquire a gun than the average anti-gunner may think, but not in the way they might assume. Let's start from the beginning. Classically, liberals and other groups whom are against the current system of firearms ownership in this country have bemoaned internet sales and the infamous gun show loophole. I can tell you right now that you cannot buy a firearm online and have it shipped to your door. That is absolutely a myth. All internet firearm sales are shipped to an FFL, it's a federal firearms license holder, who then does a background check on you through the FBI NICS system when you come in person to pick it up. They do this service for a fee, which ranges between $10 to $150. Some even charge sales tax based on the value of the firearm. There are two notable exceptions to this system. An M1 Garand from the civilian marksmanship program, if you live in a state that allows it for home delivery. For example, New York is not one of those states. And the purchase of what are considered antique firearms by the ATF. I won't go into the specifics of these two exceptions, but understand they are not serious concerns as far as the modern liberal need worry. There are no scary black rifles being sold by a KKK member in Little Rock to a white nationalist in Reno over the internet openly. And that's a key point I want to make. Notice that I said openly. We'll come back to this, but first let's talk about that infamous gun show loophole. The reality is that what happens between two associates can never be truly controlled by the government. Just as much as the DEA isn't there to smash in your car windshield when you share a joint with your buddy at the end of a cul-de-sac, the ATF won't be there when you sell your friend a pistol you bought 7 years ago and has been taking up room in your gun safe. We can ban it all we want, but person-to-person gun sales between known associates will never stop. Please understand that although I am certainly very pro-Second Amendment relative to most, I fully support background checks on all gun sales. I actually do support a ban on face-to-face sales without background checks, which effectively encompasses the gun show loophole. That said, I'm also not an idiot. I know that these sales will still happen, and we should realistically expect that. Tally that as a step in the right direction, but probably doomed to fail in that criminals will still have moderate access to guns. I know that many of you may be falling out of your seats dying to add addendums to this, for example, registering guns to individuals. Well, what if everyone's gun's serial number was tied to them, and if one of those guns turned up at a crime scene, then that person would go to jail too? I'll clear the air now in that I don't believe it is valuable to have a national firearms registry for several reasons, some of which I will get into very shortly, so please be patient and keep listening. Let's first finish up on the myth of internet gun sales. Although it certainly isn't true that anyone can just go to guns.com and buy an AR-15 with express shipping. To say that gun sales do not take place online is disingenuous. I already mentioned two legal exceptions to the rule, but there are some other illegal ones you should be aware of, one negligent and one criminal. I'll start with the more nefarious of the two, which operates on a level that some people might have not been aware of. Hopefully the Silk Road sounds familiar to most of you. If not, you should really Google it. Its story is an interesting read. For those of you whom it's familiar, you may not be aware that for a while it had an offshoot known as the Armory, which sold guns for bitcoins, essentially untraceable currency. How did this website operate? It's complex, but understand that it ran on what is known as the deep web, accessible only through Tor, a browser capable of deciphering a sort of distributed computer network. It's very complicated, and I'm definitely oversimplifying it as I barely understand it myself. If you are interested in how it all works, I highly recommend you research it further, but at the very least understand that guns were being bought and sold anonymously with untraceable currency over the internet. This is all in the past tense because Silk Road was dismantled, but there is no real reason to doubt something like the Armory could pop up again. That genie is out of the bottle. The other illegal example of online gun sales is through pure ignorance. Gun laws in this country are complex, but to understand this next point, you need only know that the ATF considers a receiver, part of a complete gun, to be the actual firearm. I apologize to those listening to this whom already know this information, but I want to make this video as accessible as possible to people of all levels of firearm knowledge. What is a receiver? In its simplest form, if you think about a bolt-action rifle, like a classic example of what someone would picture when they think of a hunting rifle, the receiver is the part that the round goes into when the bolt is moved forward after being stripped from the magazine. It's much more intricate than that, of course, as what constitutes a receiver is not clear-cut. But just understand that when talking about guns made and sold in the United States, the receiver is the part of the gun that is serialized. Every other part of the gun, effectively, is not a gun. A barrel is not a gun. A magazine is not a gun. Even all the parts of a gun together, short of the receiver, is not a gun. It's only the receiver that counts and is restricted and controlled. Having that knowledge under your belt, and with all the caveats I gave during that crash course in firearms regulation, you can hopefully see how some confusion can arise. It's not a surprise to see that some people don't clearly know which part of a gun is the receiver at all. This leads to some serious mistakes. Let me explain. I regularly browse eBay and GunBroker for firearms-related deals. In my searches, I'd say about once a week I find a felony for sale. What do I mean by that? I mean someone accidentally selling a gun online without realizing it. When I said that, I bet you thought of a pistol being sold whole, in one piece, at auction on eBay. Well, you'd be wrong. I see whole receivers for sale, most often attached to barrels, without the seller realizing what they've done. Not wanting someone to go to jail potentially over a simple mistake, I of course message them right away explaining the law and urging them to take down the listing, and they always do, gratefully. One specific example sticks in my head though that is worth mentioning. Recently I saw a full auto AK receiver for sale on GunBroker with no FFL or Class 3 license required. I was pretty shocked, but there it was. To be specific, it was an East German DDR AK receiver, and it had a buy it now price of only $250. I took some photos, of course, which I've shown here. Although I've blocked the name, note that the seller has 3,157 positive rep. Each of these is a successful transaction. This is an experienced seller, and if he could make an error, what hope is there for the average Joe? His mistake was that on AKs manufactured overseas, the front trunnion is serialized, not the receiver, which is the practice on AKs manufactured here. So he had in possession what he thought was the receiver crust, effectively a shell that he thought surrounded the actual receiver, but which was actually the front trunnion. However, in the eyes of the ATF, this shell of bent metal is the actual receiver, not the front trunnion, which is what had been serialized in Germany several decades ago. You may not appreciate this nuance or even fully comprehend it, but realize that the law can be confusing and mistakes can happen. This full auto AK receiver could have easily been sold to any buyer, even without popping up on ATF radar. Since we've been talking about serialization, I think it's probably a good segue to talk about the future of gun manufacturing in America. One of the big problems with the push for national registration is that it requires all firearms to have serial numbers. While it is true that guns sold and bought in this country must be serialized, and this accounts for the majority of firearms in circulation, there is an alternative that is becoming more and more popular: home building. You might be imagining a gun factory from the movies, where the Hells Angels have stacks of AK-47s in an assembly line being stamped by large machines. But what if I told you that you, yes you, could build a gun at home with only a $30 rotary hand drill? Not just any gun either, but a black, scary, baby-killing AR-15. There is currently a market for what are known as 80% receivers. These are receivers, remember, a receiver is the actual gun controlled by the ATF, which have 80% of the milling or casting operations finished. This means that they require roughly 20% more work to be finished. In most cases, this is just some light milling and drilling a few holes, which can easily be done at home with minimal experience and cheap tools. As they are not complete firearms, they are not regulated by the ATF. It doesn't just stop at AR-15s though. There are also flats for AKs, which must be bent into a square, and this can be done with a $100 shop press. There are also weld sets, bent blanks, castings. I could go on and on. 80% receivers are extremely common for AR-15s and AKs, but they are also easily found for 1911s, Stens, HK pattern rifles like the G3 or MP5, other AK pattern guns like the PSL or Krinkov, CZ26s, PPSH 43s and 41s, and soon for Glocks too, just to name a few of the options out there. The point is that guns are very simple to make, and they are just often bent metal with holes. This is the case for the AK, and there is a great thread from a build forum on an AK built from a shovel. Obviously, this exact build required slightly more skill, but not more than anyone motivated enough could muster. A motivated individual will always find a way. You may be wondering why the ATF would allow this, but try to understand that there is only so many steps away from becoming a gun which can be reasonably controlled. A flat piece of sheet steel that's 4.65 by 10.25 inches is already a 50% AK receiver. How could one reasonably expect to control something like that? The problem only gets worse when you talk about simple box or tube submachine guns like a Mac 11 or a Sten. The receiver on these are literally a rectangle and a pipe, respectively, with some holes cut. You could build a Sten receiver at home with a steel pipe from Lowe's or Home Depot. Unless you foresee a world where steel pipes and shovels are only sold with background checks, understand that home gun building is unstoppable. It goes without saying that guns manufactured in the home are not serialized and won't be registered. There are several arguments against this that I'd like to help nip in the bud right now. The first being that it could be the law that firearms created at home be required to be serialized and registered. But as I will address in a few minutes, the assumption of success for elective registration is extremely unrealistic. Another criticism is that we could somehow move mountains and suddenly make barrels the serialized gun part of a firearm in hopes to further curb home building. I'm nowhere near as savvy about firearms law in European nations as I am on the law in the United States, but from my basic understanding, this is one of the rules in some of the countries there. The rationale for this would be that barrels are significantly harder to manufacture on basic tooling in the home than most receivers, and this is generally true. However, to change over to serialized barrels would be a logistic and legislative nightmare. On the very best, it would leave a gaping hole of roughly 350 million guns in this country without serialized barrels. Effectively, all current guns would be untraceable in that registry, and there would be concurrent registries of serialized barrels and an ad hoc registry of serialized receivers. What's to stop a home builder from saying that their new build is pre-serialized barrel law? In addition, barrels are generally interchangeable between guns of the same manufacturer. Barrels also get shot out, that is, require replacement after several thousand rounds have passed through them, so there would be many more barrels changing hands than receivers. The home build problem gets worse yet when you consider the advent of 3D printing. There are several designs already out for pistols in which the only metal part is a nail used as the firing pin. Even the spring is a coiled design made entirely of printed plastic. These designs create headaches for several reasons, one of them being that it can pass through metal detectors. If you put a bullet into a keychain pill holder and have a nail with your spare change when you put your metal objects into that little tray before you go through a detector, say at an airport or a courthouse, you will get a single-shot pistol through security. But this has larger implications for gun control in that the limit on manufacture is only set by the amount of printer filament you have. A motivated individual could make several in a day. There are also designs for 3D printed receivers, such as that for the infamous AR-15. Perhaps the most shocking and dramatic example of home gun manufacturing for those living in denial is the Ghost Gunner machine from Defense Distributed. What you'll see in the following clip is an 80% or less receiver meeting an automated mill. It's a machine that basically prints AR-15s. My favorite part is the reformed anti-hipster hipster shooting at full auto. If this doesn't further hammer my point home, I can't imagine what else would. I've included a link to the full video below, as well as their website. When I first started talking about home builds for guns, I jokingly made reference to Hell's Angels gun factories like those seen in the movies. Make no mistake, however, there is no reason to believe that these are not real, or at least would become real given a demand. We already see this phenomenon in places like the infamous Khyber Pass, parts of the Philippines, and to a lesser extent the favelas of Brazil. Hopefully you can see from the pictures I'm displaying that these are not just pop guns, these are real, functioning automatic weapons and handguns. If you're thinking that this could never happen here in a first world country, let me tell you that you have already been proven wrong. We're already seeing it. 10% of guns seized in Australia are homemade, including these full-auto Mac 11s made by a jeweler. He made and sold hundreds to gangs before he was caught. Recently, homemade machine pistols have been popping up across Europe, including in the UK, Croatia, and the Netherlands, made by R9 Arms Corp USA, a fake company. These are a new, unpatented design, professionally made from milled steel, from high-quality parts, and capable of select fire. Changing gears, I'd like to talk briefly on the realities of gun ownership in this country and reasonable expectations for registration. A recent study, which I have referenced below, yielded that there is about 1.126 guns per person in the United States. Extrapolated out based on current census data, that's roughly 363 million guns. Technically, none of these guns are registered. There are some exceptions, like pistols in states which require registration, or even long guns in certain counties, or Class 3 firearms, such as automatic weapons. However, by and large, guns are not registered nationally. The main reason for this is the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1968, which forbids a national registry of non-NFA guns, which includes short-barrel rifles, etc. Put plainly, that means most guns. I would certainly argue that there are advantages to not having a national registry, but that is outside the scope of this video, and would be brought up in future videos in this series. When considering registration, we should perhaps look at previous attempt of elective registration and their success or failure. One such example is the New York SAFE Act, which was met with much fanfare and is even being hailed as a great success and a model for the country. The law has many faults, which I won't get too into here. It could take me a whole other video or two just to get to them all. But know that in reality it was a poorly drafted law which refers to many terms that are never legally defined and was passed in the middle of the night without the mandatory 3-day review period. For fuck's sake, several times it refers to a muzzle brake, B-R-E-A-K, instead of a muzzle brake, B-R-A-K-E. This is the level of firearms knowledge that the people who drafted it have. It's clear that it was not written by anyone with actual working knowledge of firearms. All of that aside, let's evaluate its success. The centerpiece of the law is to establish an assault weapon registry in the state and ban the sale and transfer of assault weapons. The term assault weapon alone is a misnomer, but let's move past that. From what the law defines as an assault weapon, how many registrations did it yield? A hilariously low 44,485 weapons were registered by 23,847 loyalists. The National Shooting Sports Foundation estimates that there are 1 million assault weapons in New York alone. Yikes. What if we give the benefit of the doubt and assume it's just a one-off occurrence? Isn't that possible? Maybe New Yorkers have an unusually high resolve and low threshold for regressive liberalism. Unfortunately for people who might think that way, Connecticut's own registry suffers similarly. Only 41,347 registrations of an estimated 350,000 assault weapons. It goes beyond simple civil disobedience when you also realize that local law enforcement explicitly refuses to enforce these laws. Taking New York, for example, again, there has been nearly universal dissent among county sheriffs outside of New York City and a few other counties. Over 50 counties have passed legislation to ignore the SAFE Act. The state police sheriff even has a statement on the Sheriff's Association website giving their tempered response to the bill. Although restrained in tone, it eviscerates the bill on its content, lack of clarity, and its presuppositions of the role of law enforcement in possible confiscation and registration. It outright says that law enforcement will never partake in confiscation. That being the case, what is the proposed punishment, the teeth of the bill, when it comes to failure to register? It's also worth sort of going back, contemplating that 363 million guns that I mentioned earlier. That number should be daunting to anybody legitimately proposing registration or confiscation. It would take an incredible amount of manpower to run a registry that large and to process the incredible flood of daily required modifications to it, such as a change of address or a transfer. Consider that the operating budget of the New York State DMV alone is $334 million a year. Granted, some of this budget is covered by fees paid, but it is not unreasonable to expect that it does not pay for itself. This is all assuming that people would actually register, and I hope that I have already successfully shown that they wouldn't. It's also not unreasonable to think that adding fees to cover an operating budget would only further decrease that likelihood. The intent of a registry is to dissuade undocumented sale of guns to felons. It cannot work if all guns are not registered. The kind of person whom electively registers out of fear of prosecution is clearly not the kind of person that sells guns to known felons. Since we've been focusing solely on registration, the last topic I want to address is confiscation. Anyone seriously proposing door-to-door confiscation is out of touch with reality. If anyone really thinks that that won't end in countless Waco-type scenarios, you need to really reevaluate your perception of gun ownership in this country. Local police won't do it because they won't turn on their neighbors over a law they don't support, enacted by a president they probably didn't vote for. We've already seen this dissension in the state sheriff's letter in New York. The ATF can't do it because they simply don't have enough agents. The current number being around 3,800, including purely clerical staff. At Waco, 4 agents died and 16 were wounded. Extrapolating that out, and it would only take 190 Wacos to completely exhaust the ATF ranks. That's not even considering the possibility of a second Oklahoma City-type bombing, which was motivated by what happened in Waco. There simply isn't a force large enough in this country to carry out such a task except for the military, and many of them have also already pledged never to confiscate guns, joining groups such as the Oath Keepers. Even soldiers who have not gone that far might still find it difficult to face the prospect of having to potentially kill American civilians. On the other side, we already see many die-hard gun owners in the firearms community pledging total war if the government ever comes for their guns. Many gun owners are members of militias and other groups such as the 3%ers. To be clear, the term 3%er comes from the assertion that only 3% of the colonial population took arms against the British, and that they successfully won independence. It would not be unreasonable to assume that they are not bluffing, and that action to that effect should absolutely be expected with gun confiscation, something that they consider a provocation requiring action. I hope that the picture I'm painting is clear. Without any doubt, confiscation would lead to armed rebellion. I feel that this was an exhaustive argument for just how ineffective gun control would be. Obviously, the entirety of the issue cannot be done away with by this line of reasoning alone. I have much more to say on the topic, and I will continue this series for that reason. As I stated on the outset, the function of this particular video is to temper every other subsequent argument. The point is that anyone can hear all the points I just made and still very much support gun control. That's expected. This video alone is not intended to be enough to convince everyone. It is, however, intended to expose the shaky foundation that all pro-gun control arguments must rest on, that at the end of the day, regardless of whatever laws exist, you can never stop a motivated party from gaining access to a gun, that in reality, gun control truly only affects those who follow the law and does not impact those that simply choose to ignore it. That simple choice gets simpler every day as new technology advances access to firearms, and the fear of confiscation creates new markets for underground sale and manufacture of guns. Please feel free to leave criticism, feedback, or encouragement in the comments section below. I will always try to reply, but it may not be speedy. Thank you for your time.